Guided reading, and we're on lesson 23. Now, if you remember last time in Cole's Kingdom, Cole had stayed the night at Yognar and the twins' home, and the king has sent his envoys, the people that work for him, to the town to go and talk to where they are, talk to the village. It's actually more like a village, a Furlin. So everybody's leaving their homes and walking to the square to find out what the message from the king is. So they're all walking towards the central square as the metal bell rang from the top of a short tower. After his long rest, Cole was feeling extremely talkative. How big is Furlin? It looks much bigger than the town I live in. Are there many other cities in Darius besides here and Alfar? I saw a talking mouse and a wolf yesterday. Can your pony talk too? Is it always this hot? The twins took it in turns to grunt answers. Grunt, it's like you're just saying like yes, no. You're not really giving much of an opinion. It's a bit rude to grunt. Alfar was the biggest city in Darius. Yes, there were others, but to get to them you had to cross the mountains, which was very difficult in these conditions. No, not all the animals in Darius could talk, but you could usually tell which ones could because they wore clothes. The lack of seasons meant that, yes, the weather was always the same. Cole gazed in awe. When you gaze in awe, it means amazement. At the higgledy-piggledy buildings and padlocks, the donkeys and mules pulling wagons, and the shop fronts selling chipped crockery and faded fabrics. Beaten pathways led through the town towards a collection of taller buildings in the distance, where the streets opened up into the square. Though the buildings here were grander in stature, they were still rickety looking and a little lopsided, as if they hadn't been properly looked after in a long time. In the centre of the square was a large stone basin with a plinth rising from the centre. It looked like a dried up fountain. Is that? Yeah, said Piog. That's our magic well. There was a good deal of sullen sarcasm in his voice. When you're sarcastic, you're making fun. So, for example, if it was raining outside, I could say, oh, what a lovely day. I'm being sarcastic. I'm saying the opposite of what is true. It says sullen sarcasm. Sullen is very moody and angry. So the seal of Furlin is meant to fit into that empty circle there. Remember, Cole gave the king the seal of Furlin. It should be here and it should be in that fountain to make in that magic well so that they could have seasons and food. Cole peered closer. So peer means look. On the side of the well was a circle of smooth stone as if a section had been cut from the rock. Can we go and look? Asked Cole, but by then the jostling crowd was too big. The four of them were pushed and shoved towards one side of the square, overshadowed by a huge building. Some of the building's windows were boarded up and the flags that fluttered from the poles were drab and bleached by the sun. But Cole could tell that it had once been very impressive. The crowd faced the stone steps expectantly. Although it was still early morning, Cole noticed that many of the citizens in the town were fanning themselves with branches or folded pieces of parchment. Their faces were weathered, tanned, and looked older than they should. One thing that stood out most of all was the absence of animal folk from the palace. These people were all humans. Okay, let's take a look at some of the comprehension questions for this part of the story. I'll reread this. The twins took it in turns to grunt answers. Alfar was the biggest city in Darius. Yes. There were others, but to get to them you had to cross the mountains, which was very difficult in these conditions. No, not all the animals in Darius could talk, but you could usually tell which ones because they wore clothes. The lack of seasons meant that, yes, the weather was always the same. What do we learn about the animals in Darius? Press pause and write your answer. Okay, welcome back. We learn that not all the animals in Darius can talk, but if they're wearing clothes, it means they usually can. Let's read this section now. Cole gazed in awe, remember that means in amazement, at the higgledy-piggledy buildings and the paddocks, the donkey and mules pulling wagons, and the shops fronts selling chipped crockery and faded fabrics. Beaten pathways led through the town towards a collection of taller buildings in the distance, where the streets opened up into the square. Though the buildings here were grander in stature, they were still rickety looking and a little lopsided. Now, we've got a few words here. Higgledy-piggledy. Higgledy-piggledy means all over the place, not really organised. The buildings here were grander. That means they were nicer, though they were still rickety looking and a little lopsided. Rickety means they looks like they could fall down, and lopsided means they're not straight. So it's better. This part of town is better, but it's still not perfect, as if they hadn't been properly looked after in a long time. This is all telling you how there isn't much prosperity and money, and that's because the Seal of Furlin isn't there. In the centre of the square was a large stone basin. A basin is a sink on a plinth rising from the centre. So imagine a stone sink on a kind of platform in the middle. It looked like a dried up fountain. Is that? Yeah, said Piog. That's our magic well. Now look at the word magic. It's in italics. That's our magic well. There was a good deal of sullen sarcasm in his voice. The Seal of Furlin is meant to fit into that empty circle there. So why is, when Piog says that's our magic well, why is he being sarcastic? Why is he saying that's our magic well in a sarcastic voice? Have a think about why he's being sarcastic and write a sentence for me. Press pause while you do that. Okay, so because the well is not magic, and because they really need the magic and everything is going wrong, Piog is fed up about the situation. So he's like, yeah, that's our magic well, because it's no longer magic. So Piog is sarcastic because he is upset there is no magic. So he's talking about the magic well in a sarcastic way, as it's not magic anymore. Find one piece of evidence to show the setting is very hot. I will read this, and you need to find a piece of evidence that shows it is hot. Some of the building's windows were boarded up, and the flags that fluttered from the poles were drab and bleached by the sun, but Cole could tell that it had once been very impressive. The crowd faced the stone steps expectantly. Although it was still early morning, Cole noticed that many of the citizens of the town were fanning themselves with branches or folded pieces of parchment. Their faces were weathered and tanned and looked older than they should. One thing that stood out most of all was the absence of animal folk from the palace. These people were all humans. Press pause while you find one piece of evidence that shows the setting is hot. Okay, so the flags were bleached by the sun. When you have a piece of material, for example, a flag or a blanket, if you leave it outside and it's a very hot sunny place, the colours disappear. This is what bleach means. So that's one piece of evidence. Cole noticed, although it was still early morning, they were fanning themselves. So think about when it's really hot, people get a piece of paper and they fan themselves. Now, early morning, it shouldn't be hot, really. But it's so hot that even though it's early morning, they were fanning themselves. And their faces were tanned. Okay? So when people go out in the sun, it doesn't matter what skin colour they have, their skin will eventually go darker from the sun. And that's the examples of why it's a hot setting. Okay, so that's the end of lesson 23. Thanks for taking part, and I will see you back for lesson 24.